Welcome back to the deep dive. All right, buckle up because today we are digging into something that feels, well, ancient, but still shapes pretty much every movie, every play, every gripping TV show you watch. We're diving into Aristotle's Poetics.
That's right. A foundational text.
It really is. This isn't just any old book. It's arguably the foundational text of Western literary criticism, a really systematic attempt by, one of history's greatest thinkers to figure out why stories work.
Hmm.
And our source material today is exactly what you shared with us, a digital version of this incredible text, specifically from the Project Gutenberg translation.
Good, accessible version.
Yeah. So our mission today, let's try and cut through the centuries, explore Aristotle's core arguments about poetry, especially tragedy, and pull out the surprising, still relevant insights that explain the power of storytelling, all drawn directly from his words.
And it really is remarkable how relevant it still feels.
Mm.
Aristotle wasn't just describing the plays of like 300 BC. He was dissecting the fundamental mechanics of narrative, character, emotional impact. It's a deep dive into the craft itself.
Okay, so let's unpack his starting point.
Mhm.
Aristotle kicks things off with this central idea. Art, which he calls poetry in a really broad sense, so anything made creatively with language or rhythm is fundamentally a mode of imitation. The Greek word is mimesis.
Right, mimesis. And it's crucial to understand he doesn't mean simply like photocopying reality.
Yeah.
He means representing it, reflecting it, creating a likeness or an image. It's about building a world in a way.
That distinction is key. And straight away, he gives us this framework for classifying all art forms based on this imitation idea. He says different arts vary in three ways: the medium, the objects, and the manner of imitation.
The medium, the objects, the manner. Got it.
So the medium is the stuff the art is made of. Is it rhythm, language, harmony, or some kind of combination? Think about it. Music uses harmony and rhythm. Dance uses just rhythm to imitate. Poetry uses language. A play uses language, rhythm like meter, and harmony, which is song, all together.
It's the artist's toolkit, basically, the materials.
Exactly. Then there are the objects of imitation. He says art imitates men in action, but here's where it gets interesting. The poet can represent these men as either better than they are in real life, worse, or, just as they are.
Mm-hmm.
He gives painting examples, but in poetry, Homer represents men as better, think Achilles, Odysseus. Comedy often represents them as worse, highlighting flaws, and tragedy, interestingly, also aims to represent men as somehow better than average.
So the moral focus, you could say,
Mhm.
whether you're elevating people, looking at their flaws, or just holding up a mirror, that helps define the genre.
Which leads straight to the third thing, the manner of imitation. How is this representation presented? Is it narrated, where the poet tells the story, maybe speaking as themselves, maybe taking on a character's voice like Homer does?
Right, like epic poetry.
Or is it presented dramatically with characters acting out the story directly right there in front of you?
And that second one, that's the core of drama. The word drama itself comes from the Greek for doing or action. So a playwright like Sophocles is imitating men better than average, yeah, like Homer, but he's doing it through characters acting, not just being described in a narrative.
Fascinating. So art is imitation, and you get different kinds based on what you imitate the medium, who you imitate the objects, and how you imitate the manner. The big insight here, I think, is that this isn't just historical trivia. It's a template you can still use today.
Absolutely.
You can look at a film, a game, whatever, and ask, okay, what's its medium? Who are the objects? How's it presenting the action? It gives you this universal way to categorize things.
Yeah, a way to analyze.
But why? Why do we even do this? What's the deep-seated human drive behind creating and enjoying imitation?
Mhm.
Aristotle says there are two natural causes for poetry.
The first one, maybe the most fundamental, is the instinct of imitation itself. He says it's just hardwired into us from childhood. It's how we learn our first lessons.
Right. And we get pleasure from it. This was a surprising point for me in the text. He notes we often dislike seeing painful things in reality, like, dead bodies or gross animals.
Mm-hmm.
But we can actually delight in seeing them represented accurately in art.
Yes, and his explanation is key. The pleasure isn't just in seeing the copy, the replica. It's in the act of recognition and learning.
Mhm.
You look at the painting of, say, a dead body, and the pleasure comes from that sudden thought, that is what that looks like, or, oh, that's him.
The aha moment.
Exactly, that little cognitive click. If you don't recognize what's being imitated, he says the pleasure shifts. It comes purely from the artist's skill, the colors, the technique. So the insight is that art taps into our fundamental drive to learn and make sense of the world, by recognizing patterns and representations.
That's powerful art as this kind of pleasurable learning. Okay, and the second instinct.
Our natural sense of harmony and rhythm. He just notes that meters, poetic meters, are simply forms of rhythm. We have an innate feeling for it.
Right.
And these two things, our instinct to imitate and our feel for rhythm and harmony, these are what Aristotle argues gradually led poetry to develop from, like really crude improvisational beginnings into more structured forms.
Okay, so he traces this evolution. He says early poets kind of diverged based on their own character. The more grave spirits imitated noble actions and noble people. That led to hymns and praises.
Makes sense.
While the more trivial sorts, as he calls them, imitated lower types and their meaner actions, leading to satires and lampoons, often using the iambic rhythm because it felt more like natural speech, less lofty.
And Aristotle points to Homer as this pivotal figure, almost standing between those two streams. Homer didn't just master dramatic imitation in the epic form Iliad, Odyssey,
Yeah.
but he also kind of foreshadowed comedy by dramatizing the ridiculous in works like Margites, just like his epics foreshadowed tragedy.
So you see this branching. The epic poets leading towards the tragedians and the lampooners leading towards the comedians, because dramatic forms were seen as more fully developed, more active. He describes tragedy growing from early improvisations.
He highlights key steps. Aeschylus bringing in a second actor, which was huge, and reducing the chorus's role. Sophocles adding a third actor and visual elements like scene painting.
Right, the visuals.
Plays got longer, the language became more elevated, more stately, and that iambic rhythm we mentioned became standard for dialogue because, as Aristotle says, it's the rhythm closest to everyday conversation.
Yeah.
It felt natural for back and forth.
Interesting. He mentions comedy's history is less clear, maybe starting in Sicily, and points to Athenian poets like Crates as moving comedy away from just attacking specific people towards more generalized plots, more structural comedy.
Yeah, less personal invective.
The insight here being that art forms aren't static, right?
Yeah.
They evolve, they build on what came before, driven by the artists and maybe the audience or performance needs.
Yeah, it's a development.
Now, while he touches on other forms, the real meat of the Poetics is his deep dive into tragedy. And he gives us his famous definition, bringing together a lot of these ideas we've touched on.
It's quite dense, but very specific. Tragedy is, and I'm paraphrasing slightly from the translation, an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude.
Okay.
In language embellished, in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation of these emotions.
Wow. Okay, let's break that down a bit. Serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude means the action matters, it has a clear beginning, middle, end, and it's like the right size.
Right. Not trivial, not unfinished, not too sprawling or too tiny.
Embellished language means using rhythm, harmony, song, check. Form of action, not narrative, means it's a play acted out, not a story told.
Got it.
And then the big one, through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. This last bit is Aristotle's idea of catharsis.
Catharsis, yeah.
That experiencing these intense emotions through tragedy has some kind of specific, maybe cleansing effect on us, the audience.
A very debated term, but central to his definition. And based on this, he says every tragedy must have 6 qualitative parts. Think of these as the essential ingredients.
Okay, 6 parts, what are they?
They are plot, character, diction, which is language, thought, spectacle, the visual elements, and song.
Plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, song.
Got it.
And he links these back to those 3 differences in imitation we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Song and diction are the medium, spectacle is the manner how it's presented visually, and plot, character, and thought relate to the objects of imitation, then an action, their choices, their reasoning.
So every tragedy has these 6 things.
Every single one, good or bad, must possess these 6 parts, he argues. It's their quality and how they're put together that determines the quality of the tragedy itself.
Okay, and this leads to one of his most famous and honestly often surprising arguments. Of these 6 parts, he says plot is the most important. He calls it the first principle, the soul of tragedy.
Yeah, this is where he really departs from what many people might intuitively think.
Yeah.
We have to talk about characters first, don't we? Who's the protagonist?
Totally. But Aristotle says no, the sequence of events, the plot, that's primary.
And his reasoning.
He explains why. Tragedy imitates action and life. And the purpose or end of life, for Aristotle, is a certain kind of action, not a certain quality. Character shows us what kind of people the characters are, their moral qualities.
Right.
But it's their actions, what they do, that makes them happy or unhappy in the story. So action isn't just there to reveal character. Character exists for the sake of the action.
He uses that vivid analogy with painting.
Oh yeah, tell us that one.
He says if a painter just threw the most beautiful colors onto a canvas randomly, it wouldn't be as pleasing as a simple chalk outline of a portrait. The colors are like, say, brilliant characterization or beautiful language, but the outline, the structure, that's the plot, and the structure is more fundamental. He even says you could technically have a tragedy without well-defined character, though it'd be weak, but you absolutely cannot have one without action and plot.
And crucially, he points out that the most powerful emotional elements of tragedy, those gut punches like the sudden reversal of fortune, peripeteia, and recognition, agnoresis, these are elements of the plot.
The structure delivers the punch.
Right. The structure of events is what delivers the emotional impact. The key insight here. For Aristotle, the story structure itself is the engine of tragedy. It drives meaning and emotion more than individual characters alone. It's the architecture that matters most.
Architecture, that's a good word for it.
So if plot is the soul, how do you build a good one? Aristotle gives us some rules, some principles for construction. First, it must be a whole.
A whole.
Meaning it has a clear beginning, middle, and end, where the events follow each other out of necessity or probability. It can't just be random stuff happening. There's a causal chain.
Okay, beginning, middle, end, connected logically, and it needs appropriate magnitude.
Magnitude or length.
Yeah.
Not so short it's confusing or over before you grasp it, and not so massive you can't hold it all in your memory.
Right. Can't see the whole picture if it's too big.
Exactly. It needs to be long enough to allow for that probable or necessary change of fortune, good to bad, bad to good, but still be, as he puts it, easily embraced by the memory.
So not about minutes on a clock, but about the internal logic and comprehensibility.
Precisely. And then there's unity. This is huge for him. Unity of plot, he insists, is not about having a single hero. Just telling everything that ever happened to Heracles, for instance, isn't a unified plot because one person does countless unrelated things.
Right. Life is messy. A plot needs focus. He praises Homer here, doesn't he?
He does. Homer didn't try to cram every single adventure Odysseus ever had into the Odyssey. He focused on one central action, the return and its consequences. Unity comes from the structure. If you take any part away, the whole thing should feel disrupted, incomplete.
Like a Jenga tower. Pull the wrong piece.
Exactly. If you can remove a scene or an event and it doesn't really affect the rest, it wasn't truly part of that unified plot to begin with.
This principle is why he calls episodic plots the worst. They're just one thing after another, strung together without that causal or probable link. He says it's a fault of weak writers.
Or sometimes, he admits, good writers do it maybe because they have to stretch a story for a competition or something.
External pressures. And he stresses, again, that the plot must evoke pity and fear. That's the specific emotional target zone of tragedy.
Right. And how is that best achieved?
He says it's best achieved when events happen unexpectedly, but also feel connected, like they happened because of what came before. It feels more like fate or design than just random chance.
He gives that striking example, doesn't he? The statue.
Yeah, the statue of Mides at Argos. Apparently, Mides was murdered, and later his statue fell on the murderer during a festival and killed him.
How?
It seems like pure chance, but because of who was killed and by what, it has that air of almost supernatural justice, that ironic consequence that heightens the tragic feeling. So a good plot has this internal logic, but it still produces surprising, yet connected, emotional effects.
Okay, so that's the foundation of a good plot. Then Aristotle sharpens this by talking about simple versus complex plots. A simple plot just has that change of fortune. Things go from good to bad or bad to good, but it just happens, without these key turning points.
Whereas a complex plot includes either a reversal of fortune, the Greek is peripeteia, or a recognition and agnoresis, or maybe both. And again, the real power comes when these arise naturally from the structure of the events themselves, not just dropped in out of nowhere.
Okay, let's unpack this too. Reversal, peripeteia. What's that exactly?
It's when an action that's intended to produce one effect kind of boomerangs and produces the opposite effect, but in a way that feels probable or necessary within the story's logic.
Right, the classic example from Oedipus Rex. The messenger comes thinking he's bringing good news to Oedipus, trying to relieve his fear about marrying his mother. He reveals Oedipus wasn't Polydus's real son.
But that very revelation triggers the chain of events that leads Oedipus to discover the horrifying truth of his birth. The messenger's action achieves the exact opposite of his intention. That's peripeteia.
Okay, got it. And recognition and agnoresis.
That's a change from ignorance to knowledge. It often involves recognizing a person's true identity, which then leads to a shift from love to hate, or hate to love, especially between characters who are caught up in the tragic events.
And Aristotle says the best kind of recognition happens at the same time as a reversal.
Exactly, like in Oedipus again. The moment Oedipus recognizes who he truly is the exact moment his fortune reverses completely, from respected king to a ruined outcast. The two happen together, reinforcing each other's power.
He ranks different ways recognition can happen too, right? Like some are less artistic.
Yeah, he thinks things like recognizing someone by a scar, or a token like a necklace, or even the poet, just telling the audience those are less artistic, less skillful.
What's better?
Better is recognition that comes from memory being triggered, or from process of reasoning. But the best, the most artistic according to him, is when the recognition flows inevitably, naturally, from the incidents of the plot itself. It's not tacked on. It feels like it had to happen because of everything else.
It's woven into the fabric.
Precisely. He also briefly mentions the scene of suffering as a third part, sometimes found in complex plots, any destructive or painful action shown on stage, like deaths, torture, wounds, that kind of thing.
Okay. So plot is number one, the soul. But character and thought are still vital, ranking second and third for him. What does he say about creating good characters?
Well, he lists 4 aims for character portrayal. First, they must be good.
Good, meaning morally perfect.
Not necessarily perfect, but showing moral purpose. They make choices based on some kind of ethical leaning. And this is relative to their type. Even a character who is enslaved, he says, can be good in showing moral choices relevant to their situation and character.
Okay, so showing moral agency. What's second?
Second, propriety. They must be appropriate. They must fit their type. A character meant to be wise should speak and act wisely. A warrior should show warrior-like qualities. It has to fit.
Makes sense. Third.
Third, true to life, they should be realistic, believable as human beings.
And fourth.
Consistency. They must behave consistently according to their established character. Even if their defining character trait is inconsistency, they should be consistently inconsistent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So good, appropriate, realistic, and consistent. And he points out failures based on these.
Oh yeah. He criticizes characters who act without plausible motivation. Or maybe a female character speaking with what he considered inappropriate manly valor for the time. Or a character like Iphigenia suddenly changing her nature between pleading for her life and bravely accepting sacrifice without proper dramatic justification.
Right. It has to feel earned.
And just like plot events, character actions and dialogue should follow probability or necessity. This principle, this internal logic, is why he strongly dislikes the deus ex machina.
The god from the machine. Explain that quickly.
It was a stage device, literally a crane that lowered an actor playing a god onto the stage to magically resolve a tangled plot. Aristotle says, basically, no cheating. The resolution should come from the plot itself.
So when should the gods get involved?
Only for things outside the play's central action, like explaining backstory that happened before the play started, or foretelling future events that happen after. Not to untangle the main knot, nothing irrational should be essential within the core action.
The insight here for, modern writers seems pretty clear. Make your characters' actions feel earned and believable within the world you've built. The solution shouldn't just drop out of the sky.
Absolutely. And Aristotle adds another layer. Since tragedy imitates people better than average, the poet should aim to ennoble their characters, like a good portrait painter who captures a true likeness, but also makes the subject appear more beautiful or noble than they might be in reality. Enhance, but stay true.
Okay. And thought, coming in third place.
Thought, or dianoia, refers to what the characters say when they're proving a point, stating a general truth, expressing an opinion or an argument. It's closely tied to rhetoric.
So how is it different from character?
Character reveals moral choices, what kind of person someone is, by the choices they make. Thought reveals intellectual reasoning and beliefs, what they argue or assert. It's the speech that demonstrates proof or refutation.
Got it. Okay, quick note on diction, language, and song. Song, he says, is a chief embellishment, adds a lot of pleasure.
Definitely. And diction is basically how meaning is expressed through words.
He goes into a lot of technical detail in the source about parts of language, nouns, verbs, syllables.
Very linguistic, yes.
But his main focus for poetic style is on the kinds of words poets use. He talks about current, common words, but also strange or rare words, metaphors, newly coined words, altered words, lengthened words.
A whole taxonomy of word types.
And he calls metaphor the greatest skill of all. He says it's a sign of genius because it requires having an eye for resemblances, seeing connections between different things, like calling old age the evening of life.
That ability to see similarity in dissimilar things, that's the core of metaphor.
Yeah. And his insight here on effective style is really interesting. It needs to be clear, but not flat or mean, as he puts it.
How do you achieve that?
Well, using only common, everyday words is clear, but it lacks distinction. It feels low. But using too many strange, rare, or metaphorical words makes the language obscure, like a riddle or just jargon.
So it's a balancing act.
Exactly. The perfect style for him is a blend. A moderate use of these less common word types, metaphors, rarer words, etc., to add distinction and elevation, but combined with enough clear, common language so that the meaning is still perfectly intelligible. He was actually defending poets against critics who were like, that word isn't technically correct.
Right, the literalists.
Yeah, he argued there's poetic license. Art isn't science.
It's about effect, not just precision. And you can see how relevant that still is, balancing clarity and accessibility with a distinctive voice or style in writing today. It's the same challenge.
Totally. Okay, finally, Aristotle directly tackles a debate that was apparently common in his time. Is epic poetry superior to tragedy?
Ah, yes, the showdown.
Some argued tragedy was cruder, maybe relying too much on visual spectacle and exaggerated acting, aimed at less sophisticated audiences.
The less refined argument. And Aristotle systematically counters this. First, he says, look, the criticism about gesture and acting applies to bad acting, not the art of tragedy itself. You could have over-the-top recitation in an epic, too.
Good point. Second.
Second, tragedy still achieves its effect if you just read it. Spectacle is an addition, often a powerful one, but it isn't the only way tragedy works. The power is in the text, too.
Third, and this is a big one, tragedy actually includes all the essential elements of epic poetry, complex plots, reversal recognition, character, thought, diction.
It has everything epic has.
PLUS, it has music and spectacle as added layers of pleasure and artistic effect. It's richer in its components.
And fourth, maybe the clincher for him. Tragedy achieves its specific effect, that intense experience of pity and fear, the catharsis within narrower limits.
Meaning it's shorter.
Shorter, more concentrated. He argues that a focused, condensed experience is more powerful and ultimately more pleasurable than one spread thinly over the vast length of an epic poem. Think of the impact of Oedipus Rex versus the whole Iliad. The tragedy hits hard and fast.
Right. It's more intense because it's compact. And remember his point about unity.
Exactly. Even the greatest epics, like the Iliad or Odyssey, contain enough material for multiple tragedies. That suggests to Aristotle that an epic plot, even a well-constructed one, isn't as tightly unified around a single core action as a tragedy must be.
So his conclusion is,
Tragedy is the higher art form, because it's richer in its elements, more concentrated in its effect, and ultimately fulfills its specific emotional function, the purgation of pity and fear, more completely and efficiently than epic poetry does.
a pretty decisive argument from his perspective. He also wraps up by giving us a kind of framework for answering critics, which is also incredibly practical, even now.
Yeah, how to defend artistic choices.
He says, look, poets imitate things in one of three ways. How they were or are in reality, how they are said or thought to be, like common beliefs, myths, legends, or how they ought to be, the ideal version.
The actual, the reputed, or the ideal.
Right, so if someone criticizes a detail in a poem, maybe something seems impossible or inaccurate, you can defend it. First, ask, is the error essential to the art itself, or is it just a technical mistake in some other field, like science or history, an accidental error?
Okay.
And then you can often justify the artistic choice by appealing to one of those three modes of imitation. You can say, well, that's how the myth goes, or that's how things should be ideally, or even, yes, that's improbable, but it was necessary for the plot to achieve this greater, more probable emotional effect overall. A probable impossibility is better than an improbable possibility, he argues.
It's a system for saying you're judging the art by the wrong standard. You have to judge it based on the principles of the art form itself and what the poet was trying to imitate, not just literal, external truth all the time.
That feels surprisingly modern, doesn't it? Like defending fiction or fantasy against literalist complaints.
It really does. It gives you the tools to analyze not just the art, but the criticism of the art, and understand why certain choices might be artistically justified, even if they bend reality.
Wow. Okay. We've really traced Aristotle's argument here from that basic idea of imitation all the way through the detailed structure of tragedy, the role of character, the power of language, and even how to handle critics.
It's such a systematic approach, a masterclass in analytical thinking applied to creativity.
Yeah.
You really can't read the Poetics, even now, without starting to see the bones of storytelling everywhere,
Yeah.
in screenplays, novels, even complex video game narratives.
Definitely.
His ideas about plot structure being primary, about character motivation, driving action, the power of surprise and recognition, they're just timeless.
Absolutely. So what does this deep dive mean for you listening? Well, maybe next time you're watching a movie or reading a book that really grabs you, that really works, pause and think. How is the plot constructed? Can you spot the moments of reversal or recognition? How do the characters' actions push the story forward? Are they consistent?
And perhaps consider that really fascinating and still debated idea of catharsis. Why is it that stories that make us feel pity and fear, stories often of suffering and downfall, can also provide a specific kind of pleasure or release? Aristotle thought it was a proper purgation.
Right, a way to process those difficult emotions safely through the lens of art.
It's a question that still sparks discussion. What is it about experiencing these powerful emotions from a distance, through a story, that resonates so deeply and provides something uniquely valuable? Is it really a cleansing? Or is it something else entirely?
A great question to ponder.
Something to think about the next time a great, perhaps even tragic story really moves you.